When someone with an anxious attachment style walks away, it rarely looks like strength in the moment. It often looks like heartbreak, like silence that's heavy with pain, like pulling away while still wanting to be held. But what most people don't see is that when an anxious person walks away, it's one of the strongest, most pivotal decisions they ever make. This isn't a rash act. It's not about playing games or trying to manipulate someone into chasing them. It's the product of hundreds of internal conversations, emotional highs and lows, repeated self-doubt, and finally a quiet acceptance that enough is enough. The anxious partner is often misunderstood. They're the ones who seem to want too much, too fast. They ask for reassurance. They need consistency. They crave connection. And because of this, they often get labeled as needy or clingy. But at the core, they're just looking for safety, for someone who will stand still instead of pulling away the moment things get vulnerable, for someone who meets their affection with stability, not distance. When they don't get that, they begin to twist themselves into emotional knots trying to understand why. They internalize the distance, they blame themselves, they work harder, give more, compromise endlessly, hoping that if they just show enough love, they'll finally feel it in return. So when an anxious person finally walks away, it doesn't come from strength they've always had. It comes from strength they've earned. It comes from exhaustion, from one too many nights staring at a phone that didn't ring, from second-guessing their worth in the presence of someone emotionally unavailable. It comes from realizing that no amount of emotional chasing will ever fix what someone else isn't ready to give. It comes from grieving a connection that was always just out of reach and accepting that staying is costing more of their peace than leaving ever will. This moment of walking away isn't sudden. It's a slow, painful build. First, they notice the pattern: hot and cold behavior, deep talks followed by silence, moments of connection followed by withdrawal. Then comes the self-questioning. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I just need to be more patient. Maybe they really do care, they're just scared. They rationalize the inconsistency. They make excuses for the distance. They hold on, sometimes for months or years, to the hope that things will shift if they just love harder. Eventually, though, the emotional cost becomes too high. They start to see that their needs aren't being met, not because they're unreasonable, but because they're not being heard. They realize they've been showing up fully for someone who only shows up halfway. And even though it hurts to admit, they begin to understand that someone who runs from intimacy isn't going to suddenly wake up one day and be ready to meet them where they are. The breaking point isn't loud, it's quiet. It's the decision to stop fighting for crumbs, to stop shrinking themselves to be more digestible, to stop apologizing for needing closeness in a world that keeps telling them to be cool and casual. It's the moment they reclaim their voice and say, I deserve more than this. I deserve to feel secure. I deserve someone who doesn't make me doubt how they feel every other day. And that's where the shift begins. Because the anxious person who was once so wrapped up in trying to hold the relationship together finally starts to redirect their energy inward. Instead of obsessing over every text, every signal, every withdrawal, they begin to focus on their own healing. They begin to create space for peace, not chaos. They stop chasing someone else's love and start discovering their own. And although they might still feel the sting of walking away, deep down they know they're doing the bravest thing they've ever done, choosing themselves in a situation that kept asking them to abandon who they are. The power of the anxious person walking away is not just in the act itself, but in the realization that they no longer need to be chosen by someone who couldn't see their worth. It's in understanding that their love isn't the problem. It's their habit of giving it to people who aren't emotionally available enough to receive it. They come to see that their sensitivity, their depth, their desire for connection, those things aren't flaws. They're gifts. But they need to be shared with someone who sees them that way too. So when they walk away, it's not weakness, it's not drama, it's a declaration, a quiet, painful, necessary declaration that they are finally done trying to convince someone to love them back. The avoidant partner often moves through relationships with a kind of emotional detachment that can feel confusing and even hurtful to someone who craves intimacy. They crave closeness, but are deeply uncomfortable with vulnerability, so they keep their distance just enough to feel in control. They stay 1 foot in and 1 foot out. They respond, but not too quickly. They engage, but only up to a point. They show interest, but when things start to deepen, they instinctively pull back. It's not because they don't care at all. It's because closeness stirs something inside them they haven't yet learned how to manage. To the avoidant, independence is safety. Emotional space is comfort. They don't even always realize they're doing it, creating distance, downplaying feelings, avoiding conversations that might draw them in too close. It becomes a pattern so deeply rooted in them that it feels normal. They might even mistake emotional unavailability for strength or self-protection. They've likely learned at some point in their life that vulnerability leads to pain or disappointment. So they cope by keeping their heart just out of reach, by controlling the level of intimacy they allow, and by staying emotionally guarded even when the connection is real. When they're with someone who has an anxious attachment style, they often feel overwhelmed. The anxious partner's desire for reassurance and closeness can trigger the avoidant's fear of being engulfed or losing their autonomy. Instead of seeing the need for connection as an invitation to build trust, they see it as pressure, and so they retreat. They pull away, give vague answers, create ambiguity. They don't necessarily intend to hurt the other person. They're just reacting to their own discomfort. And while they might enjoy the connection in moments of ease, they disappear emotionally when things become emotionally intense. Over time, the anxious partner begins to notice the pattern. They feel confused, hurt, and increasingly insecure. They give more, ask for less, try harder to be low maintenance. They try to keep the avoidant engaged by proving they're worth staying for. But the more they try, the more the avoidant retreats. It becomes a cycle where one person is constantly reaching out while the other is pulling away. And the avoidant, consciously or not, starts to take the anxious person's presence for granted. They believe they can stay distant and still be wanted. They believe they can avoid depth and still be pursued. But then something shifts. The anxious partner, after weeks or months or years of holding on, finally lets go. They stop texting. They stop checking in. They stop waiting for the avoidant to open up. And this silence, this lack of pursuit, is something the avoidant never prepared for. It's the one thing that breaks through their emotional armor, because they had always counted on the other person being there, waiting, forgiving, understanding. The absence of that pursuit feels disorienting. It unsettles them in a way nothing else has. At first, they may not even recognize what's happening. They might tell themselves the space feels good, that things were getting too heavy anyway. They might enjoy the quiet, mistaking it for freedom. But slowly, that silence starts to echo. The messages stop. The invitations stop. The warmth, the care, the consistent emotional presence. They all disappear. And in that space, the avoidant is left alone with something they've tried hard to avoid, the weight of their own feelings. The person who always made them feel wanted is no longer around to soften the edges of their detachment. Now, without the anxious partner filling in the gaps, they begin to feel the emptiness they've been avoiding. They start replaying memories, wondering if they pushed too hard, pulled away too much, gave too little. They begin to feel regret, but it's not the dramatic kind. It's quiet and unsettling. It lives in the moments when they instinctively reach for their phone and remember there's no one reaching out anymore. It creeps in during the day when they remember how safe it once felt to be wanted, even when they couldn't fully return it. They start to understand that what they lost wasn't just attention, it was someone who truly cared, who showed up, who loved them in spite of their walls. This becomes the beginning of their internal reckoning. For the first time, they're not running from closeness, they're longing for it. But the difference now is that it's no longer being handed to them unconditionally. They have to face what they've pushed away. The nightmare isn't just losing the person. It's realizing they never fully allowed themselves to receive what was being offered. And for someone who's built their identity around not needing anyone, that kind of realization is deeply unsettling. When the anxious partner finally pulls back, it creates a silence that does more than just echo. It exposes. It brings to the surface emotions that have been buried under the noise of pursuit, reassurance, and emotional chasing. While the relationship was active, the avoidant could hide behind distance, behind slow replies, behind the convenient excuse of needing space. They could rely on the predictability of the anxious partner reaching out, initiating contact, asking the difficult questions, holding the emotional weight for both people. But the moment that anxious person goes quiet, everything changes. The dynamic doesn't just shift, it collapses. Silence becomes the mirror. The absence of a message becomes more noticeable than the presence of one ever was. Where once there was a constant stream of checking in, now there is nothing. No reminders of being cared for, no soft nudges to stay connected, no emotional prompts. The avoidant, who once felt overwhelmed by closeness, now begins to feel something they couldn't access before, the ache of true distance. Because when someone who used to chase stops chasing, it removes the pressure, but it also removes the security, and suddenly the silence becomes more intimate than any words ever were. This is where discomfort begins to grow. Not because of drama, not because of conflict, but because of the sheer absence of what was once familiar. The avoidant, who built emotional distance as a form of safety, starts to feel the discomfort that comes from realizing no one is waiting anymore. They don't get to control the level of closeness because there is no closeness left to manage. There's no warmth on standby. The safety net they didn't know they had has disappeared. And now they're left alone, not just physically, but emotionally. Avoidant people often rely on space to regulate themselves. They depend on it to soothe anxiety, to calm their fears of intimacy. But what they never quite learn to navigate is what to do when space no longer feels like a choice. It feels like abandonment. When the anxious partner steps back, the avoidant can no longer distract themselves with the idea that someone is always waiting in the wings. That quiet becomes suffocating, and it's in that quiet that they begin to ask questions they never allowed themselves to ask before. What did I just lose? Why didn't I hold on when I had the chance? Was I pushing someone away who was trying to love me? The truth is, when someone is always available, it's easy to take their presence for granted. It's easy to believe they'll always come back, always forgive, always understand. But when the anxious partner finally learns their value and chooses themselves instead of staying in a space of emotional depletion, they stop showing up in all the ways they once did. And the avoidant, who once believed they didn't need anyone, suddenly starts to feel the sting of being left behind. Not with anger, not with blame, but with absence. The kind of absence that lingers. Without the usual tension of being pursued, without someone pulling at their emotions, the avoidant starts to feel the very connection they thought they didn't need. It comes back to them not as pressure, but as longing. They remember the late-night conversations, the affection they once dodged, the vulnerability they kept at arm's length. And for the first time, they're not reacting to someone else's need. They're feeling their own. They feel it in the moments of stillness when they realize no one is reaching out anymore. They feel it in the little habits that are now just memories, the morning messages, the emotional check-ins, the steady love they weren't ready to fully receive. This silence becomes their teacher. It reveals what their defense mechanisms never could, because when the noise stops, what's left is clarity. And for the avoidant, that clarity often arrives with a deep sense of loss. Not because the other person stopped caring, but because they finally started caring for themselves. That shift isn't just felt emotionally, it's felt physically. The absence becomes a weight, the stillness becomes a reckoning, and it's in this space where the anxious partner is no longer present that the avoidant is finally confronted by the emotional consequences of their own behavior. They start to understand that emotional safety was always being offered. It just made them uncomfortable. That affection wasn't pressure, it was connection. That what they interpreted as too much was actually someone trying to build something real with them. And now, with nothing left but silence, they're finally in a position where avoidance no longer works, because there's nothing left to avoid, only the truth they never wanted to face. When the anxious partner finally walks away and begins to focus on themselves, a quiet transformation starts to unfold. What once felt like a loss of control for them begins to feel like a reclaiming of power. For so long, they poured their energy into maintaining the relationship, interpreting mixed signals, overanalyzing silence, and trying to make sense of someone who only ever gave half of themselves. But when they stop reaching out, when they stop waiting for responses that never come or affection that's always inconsistent, they create space. Space that was never allowed to exist while they were caught in the loop of trying to hold everything together. This space isn't empty. It's full of possibility. It allows them to return to themselves, to remember what life felt like before they were stuck in a dynamic that constantly made them question their worth. And something interesting happens in this space. The anxious person, who once felt powerless, begins to realize they don't need the relationship to feel whole. The energy they used to spend managing someone else's emotional distance is now redirected toward their own healing, their own joy, their own peace. The craving for connection no longer overrides their need for self-respect. They aren't reaching out, not because they're playing games, but because they're genuinely done trying to convince someone to show up for them. Meanwhile, on the other side of this shift, the avoidant starts to feel the change. In the beginning, it might seem like nothing's wrong. They may even feel relieved by the lack of pressure. But slowly, subtly, they begin to notice the absence of energy that once flowed toward them. The phone doesn't buzz like it used to. There are no long messages to ignore, no last-minute plans to cancel. The consistency that used to feel suffocating is now completely gone. And that's when something begins to stir inside them. Avoidants are used to being desired from a distance. They build walls to maintain control over their emotions, but they often don't realize how much they rely on the other person's presence to feel secure in the role they've created for themselves. They feel safer when they're being pursued because it allows them to stay in control of the pace and depth of intimacy. But when the anxious person stops chasing, the dynamic breaks, the control is gone, the predictability is gone. And with it, the emotional buffer they depended on begins to disappear. As the anxious partner detaches and starts to live life on their terms, they begin to show up differently. They are no longer consumed by the need to decode someone's behavior. They become more grounded, more intentional, more centered. They invest in their passions, their friendships, their own growth. Their energy shifts from seeking external validation to finding internal alignment. And without realizing it, this shift creates a kind of magnetic pull. The very thing that once made them feel like they were too much now becomes the thing that draws the avoidant back in. The roles begin to reverse. The avoidant, who once pulled away at any sign of closeness, begins to miss the emotional security they once resisted. They start to feel drawn to the same depth they used to avoid. They may reach out casually at first, testing the waters, a short message, a social media like, an indirect reminder that they still exist. But beneath the surface of those small gestures is a growing discomfort, an unfamiliar and unsettling desire to reconnect with the person they once kept at arm's length. They realize the emotional presence they once took for granted is not easily replaced. That kind of steady, loyal love doesn't come around often. And now that it's no longer available to them, they begin to feel the cost of their distance. What they're feeling is not just the loss of a person, but the loss of how that person made them feel. Seen, wanted, cared for, even when they didn't know how to ask for it. And now, the anxious person is no longer looking back. They've stepped into a space of self-worth that no longer entertains breadcrumbs. The avoidant, for the first time, is not being pulled towards someone who needs them, but towards someone who has outgrown the need to be needed in that way. The connection isn't about emotional survival anymore. It's about alignment. And in that shift, everything they once ran from now starts to look like something worth chasing. There comes a point when the dynamic between the anxious and the avoidant reaches a complete reversal. Not because either person set out to make it happen, but because the emotional energy that once defined the relationship has completely shifted. The anxious partner, once so wrapped up in the cycle of overgiving and overthinking, begins to evolve. And as they evolve, the very behaviors that once made them feel small or desperate are replaced by calm, self-awareness, and boundaries. What used to be emotional chasing turns into stillness. What used to be fear of abandonment turns into an understanding that not every loss is a tragedy. Sometimes it's a redirection to something healthier. This shift is quiet, but powerful. The anxious partner stops waiting for validation from someone who never knew how to provide it. They stop hoping that one more conversation will fix what has always been out of alignment. They begin to see that their worth is not measured by how hard they try to hold on to someone who doesn't want to be held. And when that realization truly lands, something inside them clicks. The cycle of trying to earn love from someone emotionally unavailable breaks. And for the first time, they see that walking away was never a weakness. It was wisdom. That wisdom shows up in the way they start protecting their peace. They're no longer afraid of silence because they've come to see that silence is better than begging for connection. They're no longer hurt by distance because they now recognize emotional distance as a choice, not a mystery. They stop personalizing the avoidance behavior and start understanding it as a reflection of that person's limitations, not their own lack of worth. And in doing so, they free themselves from a narrative that told them they had to prove their value to be loved. The avoidant begins to feel this shift long before they understand it. They feel it in the lack of pressure. They feel it in the way the anxious partner no longer reacts emotionally to their withdrawal. They feel it in the space that's been created. Not the kind of space they used to crave, but the kind of space that now feels like disconnection. And this time, that disconnection isn't coming from the anxious partner needing too much. It's coming from the anxious partner no longer needing them at all. For someone used to emotional distance being on their terms, this is deeply unsettling. Because what they now see is a person who is no longer emotionally tethered to them. Someone who no longer flinches when they pull away. Someone who no longer reaches out to ask where they stand. The anxious partner has become emotionally self-sufficient, and in doing so, they've disrupted the dynamic entirely. The avoidant no longer holds the power they once did, and what used to feel safe, being emotionally aloof, now starts to feel like loneliness. As the anxious partner grows into this newfound self-assurance, they start attracting different kinds of relationships, ones where their emotional availability is matched. They start to understand what it means to be met at the same level. They no longer settle for confusion, for inconsistency, for emotional crumbs. Their standard rises, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. And when they look back at the dynamic they used to be in, they don't see a person they lost. They see a lesson they finally learned. On the other side, the avoidant is left with the weight of their choices. They remember the comfort of being desired without having to give much back. They remember the way the anxious partner showed up with their whole heart, even when it wasn't being fully received. They remember the loyalty, the patience, the care, and they begin to feel the cost of their emotional distance, not just in the loss of a relationship, but in the realization that someone once saw them deeply and they couldn't see that person back, not because they didn't care, but because they weren't ready. What was once dismissed as neediness now starts to look like emotional courage. What was once overwhelming now looks like rare vulnerability. The very things the avoidant tried to avoid become the things they long for. But by the time they recognize the depth of what they had, the anxious partner is no longer standing in the same place. They're not waiting, they're not hoping, they're moving forward, not to prove a point, not to make anyone regret, but because they finally trust themselves enough to choose peace over potential. And in that choice, the entire dynamic they once existed in becomes nothing more than a chapter they've outgrown.